Still awake? Show of hands if you're awake. All right, excellent. So today I'd like to talk to you about the idea of owning your cybersecurity mid-game. And it's actually a great segue from what Nick was just presenting about how to deal with attackers and ransomware people when they're trying to extort you for your money. Hopefully I can give you some tips and some advice so that you don't need to have that conversation. So is anyone familiar with the idea of the cybersecurity mid-game, what that might entail? Okay. If not, excellent, that's what we're going to go through today. And to start with, a bit of context, kind of building on from what Nick just presented, we talk about the main threat most organisations are concerned with today. It is that of ransomware. And we've seen ransomware evolve quite markedly over the last few years, although from sort of 2016 and just before, when ransomware first appeared and became a thing, right? It was just simple phishing attacks, it was one-off attacks against individuals, and sometimes maybe a worm that spread randomly across the internet, just indiscriminately encrypting things and putting up a message to say, pay some Bitcoin or pay a bit of crypto to some address. What we've seen it evolve into is it's evolved away from that simple bit of code or that piece of malware, and today we're really dealing with organised crime. We're dealing with criminals. We're dealing with teams of people that have hands on keyboard performing attacks. And the methods that they're using are quite similar to the nation state or the APT type threats we've also been dealing with over the last number of years. And so we've seen their initial access, for example, evolve from being that random phish or a stolen credential into using the same techniques for initial access that we see advanced threat actors use. They're looking for exposed services like remote desktop protocol, and things that they can just easily use to get access to their network. Maybe someone's published a server with remote desktop access and hasn't used multi-factor authentication. And so it's not a low-hanging fruit for them to be able to get access. We've also seen the increase of groups called Internet Initial Access Broker, which is really just the team of people, they're trying to find a way in. They're just scanning the internet, using tools like Shodan, using other methods to find vulnerable systems. They break into it, and then they figure out what they've actually got access to. They don't know the organisation. It wasn't necessarily targeted. So we're seeing this kind of initial access taking place. And this is where, traditionally from a security perspective, we've been very focused on trying to prevent that initial access, right? We build up the protection, we build up the preventative controls, but we're still seeing attackers getting past those. So introducing today this idea of the mid-game to see what we can do next. But just to put ransomware into context, most people think that paying the ransom is going to be the most expensive part of dealing with a ransomware campaign or dealing with a ransomware incident. What we've seen over a number of attacks is the actual cost of the ransom itself is probably only about 10% of the overall cost associated with trying to recover from the incident. You've got to go through legal fees, maybe PR exercise to be able to get into the press. You need to deal with that, dealing with the data loss, and dealing with other things that are associated with the ransomware attack itself. It starts to add up and it becomes much bigger than just the cost of the actual ransom itself. So how do we avoid getting to this point where we have to pay the ransom? So I want to take an example from the physical world. We're using analogies in cybersecurity. It's always really good. And so I'm going to use an analogy from the world of chess. Anybody see The Queen's Gambit on Netflix recently? Right? Great story about chess and how chess players build out their game. And quite often we get very distracted when we're doing something like chess, where we get very focused on what's the initial move, what's the opening move I'm going to make, what's the best way to open up my game. And then very focused on how do I take out the opponent's king, right? That's the end game. But most of the game of chess is carried out in what we call that mid-game. Right? You make that first move, you've then got to have your strategy around how you're going to get to your end game. It doesn't happen straight away. And this is the kind of thing we can think about when we look at an attacker like a ransomware group. What's their opening of their game, right? That's the initial access. What's their end game? Well, that's encrypting the files. As Nick said, there's also the data exfiltration aspect and the extortion side. I've heard that described as a double-pronged strategy of the leak and the lock. Right? They leak the data out and threaten to leak it if you don't pay the ransom, but also run their encryptor and lock the files or destroy the files. So how does the attacker get from that opening gambit, that first move, that initial access, through to actually running the encryptor and getting access to the files? And that's the mid-game. That's where we can actually spot some of the things they're doing and take action and prevent them from getting to that end game. So if we look at an example, what we refer to as a ransomware kill chain, we look through that initial opening access. What are the things that they're going to try and do to get access into the environment? So like on the previous slide, so the phishing, the stolen credentials, drive-by downloads, remote desktop, open services, vulnerable systems that can be exploited. They're all the things the attacker is going to do. And that's where we've typically spent a lot of time and energy as an industry in cybersecurity trying to prevent that initial access. If you've been in cybersecurity long enough, you would have heard the accent that eventually the attacker is going to find a way in. If they're a motivated attacker, they're targeted with getting access to your organization, they're going to keep rattling the doorknobs until they find a door that opens up. So they're going to find a way in. And for a lot of people, they think, well, they've got in, that's the end of the day. There's nothing we can do about it. That's where the mid-game comes in. Once they've got access into the environment, and you may have heard this described before also as sort of post-compromise type approach, where we accept once they've got it in, we need to be able to find what they're doing on the network. So that's what they're doing the mid-game. Once they get access to their network, they're going to start looking around. They're going to do reconnaissance to find where the sensitive information is. They're going to do domain escalation or privilege escalation to get admin privileges so they can easily move around the network. They can deploy their tools and they can find that sensitive data. They'll use command and control to run these campaigns. Right? They're going to be promoting in to the environment via their tools. These are all things that we can try and discover and see on the network inside the environment before they carry out their actual end game. That end game, of course, is finding all the application services, finding the file servers, finding the databases, finding where that sensitive information is so they can't leak it out, they can exfiltrate it, so they can then hold you to ransom and extortion, otherwise they pay the money when we release it, as well as the actual encryption as well from the ransomware side of things. So what can we do in this bid game? What else can we do there? You may have heard this idea, as I said before, when the attacker gets through, we've heard this idea, this is what we call the defender's dilemma, and this is a phrase that I've heard over and over again in my time in cybersecurity, and I really hate it. It's very defeatist. Right? Everyone's probably heard this, that idea that intrusions are inevitable, and defenders have to be right 100% of the time, while the attacker only has to be right once. Who's heard that sort of saying before? A lot of people there. What we want to do is turn that around and actually introduce the idea of the intruder's dilemma. The intruder's dilemma is once the attacker's inside, they're on your turf. They're in unfamiliar territory. You need to make it difficult for them to move around inside the environment without being observed. So in this case, they only need to misstep once, or you only need to be able to detect one of their actions to then trigger off a response to make sure you can actually deal with them before they reach their end game. So I want to try and implement the intruder's dilemma. So how can we do this? What kind of things can we look for to see what an attacker might be doing if they're present on the network before they get to that end game? A lot of ransomware protection is focused on trying to find that malware, right? Trying to find that executable as it's spreading through the network. By that time, it's kind of too late. We want to see it before we get to there. So what sort of things can we do? There's a great resource that I encourage everyone to go online, not just Nick's playbook there from CyberCX, but looking at things like the DFIR report. Is anyone familiar with that website? DFIR, Digital Forensics Incident Response. So the DFIR report is a collection of incident response analysts that write up their cases that they've worked on in detail, and they don't focus on what was the IP address of the C2 that was used for the campaign, or what was the SHA hash of the malware, or the version of Mimikatz that was used. They focus more on the techniques that the attackers are using. So it becomes information that we can use to monitor on our environment to see any of that activity as it occurs. In this example, this was a write-up from the end of last year on a case study for the Conti ransomware group, and they mapped it out over the initial access on day 0, to be able to trace back and see it was a word macro that was used to download the Bazaar loader, which is an initial stage malware that's used quite a lot to get access to a system and then download the other components of the malware that they're going to use for remote access and for the rest of their tooling. We can see here, mapped over the 5 days it took in this case between when the initial access occurred to when the ransomware was actually run on the network, right? It was 5 days that this took place. There are 5 days of activities that, if we're looking in the right place, we could have had a tip-off. We could have seen what was going on. So on day one, they started using enumeration techniques to understand what services are actually deployed on the network and what's available for them to interact with, to escalate their privileges, or to find that sensitive information. So they're using tools like NetStat, using NLTest and ping, PowerView, AD find, all these commands which, being used by an administrator, can be used for good, but being used by an attacker are helping them find out information on the network. We saw there was Cobalt Strike being used for command and control. You see there was process injection occurring and lateral movement from these systems. That's all on day one. If you're able to detect any one of those activities or a couple of those activities on day one, that's a good heads up that something nefarious might be happening in the environment. And as you move through day 2 and day 3, we see lateral movement, remote desktop being used to access the backup systems. As Nick said, a good attacker is going to delete all the backups, so that's not going to be a way to come back from the attack. So you start seeing access to those kinds of backup systems from different places to what you normally see. More command and control taking place. Day 3, they had a day off, no action occurred. On day 4, we see data staging occur. This is where we start to see an attacker that's found where the sensitive data is. They start copying it from whatever server it's on, whether it's a database or a file share. They stage it somewhere. They download it from that source, they stage it, they zip it up, and that's what they use to exfiltrate for that leak part of the attack. So all these things that are happening day 1, 2, 3, 4, before we get to day 5, where the ransomware starts to be deployed, it starts encrypting all the systems. And in most cases, when we're talking about deploying ransomware, sometimes it is a worm that spreads automatically throughout the network. But a lot of times, it's a human that's operating it. They're running things like, through the domain controller, they're using group policy to push the malware out, to push their ransomware encryptor out using those techniques rather than relying on a worm that's spreading. So we've got these different things we can spot to see that being propagated before it's actually executed in the end. So that's what we're trying to do with this idea at the mid-game, is find these different opportunities that we have to detect this attacker activity before it gets to that final stage. We talk about different ways to detect these techniques. I've got my words there. From a defender's perspective, we've had different tools available for a while, and for a long time we've spoken about the idea of the SOC visibility triad, which we've focused on combining visibility from endpoint technology like endpoint detection response, combining visibility from SIEM, when I say centralizing and logging, centralizing alerts from different technologies, and also combining that with network visibility or network detection response, as it's known now. And over many years, we've referred to this as the visibility triad. Now, sort of combining these different techniques together and different technologies together, is now being referred to as XDR. You may have heard that phrase been used a lot in the last 2 days. A lot of the vendors on the floor there talking about XDR as well. In my view, XDR isn't really a product, right? XDR is more of a philosophy or a strategy. And it's helping to understand what are the threats that I will need to detect in my environment, and what different technologies do I need to have in place to get visibility in order to detect those threats. And you can see here, yes, I'm from ExtraHop, I'm from a vendor, we have a tool that helps with this, but we help to complement the visibility that you may be getting from those older or more traditional tools that have been around for a few more years around endpoint visibility and seeing from a logging perspective. To give you an example of what we mean by the visibility you can get from an NDR solution, it's kind of like having that surveillance camera that's monitoring, in this case, the whole neighborhood. We can see all of the houses in the block. We can see all of the assets that are communicating on the network without any blind spots. Right? You see there the picture there for NDR showing the outside of all the houses and a close-up of one of the house on the screen there. When you move to EDR, and EDR gives you that X-ray view of what's happening inside that house. Right? It gives you that great view, what processes are running, if there's process injection or interaction from executables and files and registries, etc. But the problem that I see with a lot of EDR deployments is it can be quite patchy. Right? It's never installed on every single device on the network, either because there's bring your own devices that you can't put an agent on, there are IoT devices or other security appliances where you can't install a device, or install an agent, sorry. In most data centers, there's that box in the corner, which is probably an old Unix flavor, which no one really knows what it does anymore, if no one's game to turn it off, and no one's game to try and install an agent on there or reboot it. So how do you get visibility into what's happening on those old legacy systems? That's where network visibility can help to show the communications between those different devices. And from a SIEM perspective, SIEM is great. I've used SIEM in the past, I've used EDR in the past as well. The problem we see with a lot of SIEM deployments is, again, it's not completely instrumented to collect all the logs that you want from an investigation perspective. A lot of SIEMs were deployed in the last 5 or 10 years to focus more on a compliance angle. You need to get that tick in the box that says you're centrally collecting all of your logs, get that tick in the box, but no one's actually looking at it. And the types of logs you're actually receiving may not be the ones that you want to help with incident response. A lot of times I saw working in IR, the number of web servers with IIS where the logs weren't being centralized, the number of databases where the security team wanted to enable logging on those servers, but the security or the database administrators wouldn't allow it because you have to turn on the trace auditing, and that has a performance impact on how the server can work. So the last thing you want to do is impact the performance and the usability of the service, so the logging gets left behind. So the SIEM can give you a kind of fuzzy picture as to what's happening. But the other is combining visibility from these different tools together can give you the best chance of spotting these techniques that an attacker is going to go through before they're able to reach their end game. And as an example, so there was a well-publicized ransomware attack last year done by the DarkSide group that affected a company called Colonial Pipeline in the US. So quite well known, it was just over a year ago now. What they saw was after their initial intrusion, the attacker behavior was missed by the tooling they had in their environment. They had next-gen firewall, they had CASB, they had intrusion detection, intrusion prevention, they had EDR, they had DLP, they had everything, but they didn't have complete coverage. And so once the ransomware started to be deployed, the business had to make a decision. The business didn't have visibility into where the ransomware was deployed and how far-reaching the impact might be. So they had to make a choice to actually shut down their operations to prevent the attack from spreading. They didn't have that visibility. So they had the breach, and overall there was a $153 million cost to the business through cost to consumers. There was a number of days of downtime and a $5 million ransom payment they had to make to get back online. At a similar time, there was another victim, and this was a large Canadian retail firm that had ExtraHop Reveal X deployed. They were able to spot those mid-game tactics, those mid-game techniques, and able to stop the attack before it got to the final stage. So they were able to see the campaign, they were able to see some database staging, I think it was a SMB or SIF staging, followed by ransomware starting to be deployed. In their case, they were able to spot the files, spot the encryption just as it was starting. They had around 20,000 files out of over millions that got encrypted. They were able to continue without any downtime and didn't have to pay a ransom because they could easily get back to what they were looking at, because they were able to stop the attack before it was widespread in their environment. So from ExtraHop and Reveal X, we can help you detect these techniques as they're occurring and these tactics as they're happening on the network. And if you haven't had need more information about what we do as ExtraHop, come and see us on the stand out the front there in the networking hall. Happy to give you a demonstration and talk to you about this in more detail. But we provide network visibility to help you detect these attacker techniques, what we call that mid-game, before they're able to get to their final end game and run their campaign, run their malware. So as a final call to action, it's all about just tools and what technologies you can provide. We need to upskill our knowledge as well. So understanding what is an attacker going to do if they get access to the environment. Once they get through those preventative controls, they get through your perimeter, what are the things they're going to do? So as a call to action, I urge you to visit the DFIR report website there, read, subscribe to their newsletter about once a month. They publish new intrusion reports with great detail in the types of things they're seeing attackers do in their successful campaigns. And if we upskill our knowledge and deploy the right visibility, we can help to make that intruder's dilemma a reality, where as soon as the attacker makes a misstep or carries out a part of their mid-game on your environment, you're able to detect them and take action before they can complete their objective. So please go and read up the FIR report. I urge you to find the site. At that point in time, my time is up. It's good timing. Thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. And please come see us next time for some information. Thank you.
So tadi hilang ya?
Okay, thank you.